Breathing through a swollen nose made the damp air taste like rusted iron and stale beer. She needed a human sacrifice from the crowd to satisfy the restless mob. Her heavy glove pointed at a quiet, slight man in a gray jacket. She never suspected she'd just challenged a hurricane. Morgan spat a mouthful of pink saliva into the dented tin bucket. It hit the metal with a hollow, pathetic smack. Her tongue pressed against the inside of her cheek, probing a raw, swollen groove where her own teeth had bitten down hard. The warehouse was a pressure cooker of unwashed bodies, stale cigarette smoke, and spilled Pabst Blue Ribbon. Above her, a single row of halogen lamps hummed a high, broken pitch that vibrated against her aching skull. She was 26, but her knees felt 40. Every time she shifted her weight on the canvas, a sharp, familiar twinge shot up her left shin. Microfractures, the compounding interest of a career spent kicking heavy bags and heavier men. "You're coasting, Morg," Lenny muttered, leaning his thick forearms on the ring apron. He smelled overwhelmingly of wintergreen liniment and cheap cigars. "They didn't pay $5 a head to watch you point spar. Give 'em blood." Morgan glared down at him, her chest heaving beneath her soaked sports bra. She had just spent 3 rounds dismantling a local heavyweight named Hank. She had chopped his lead leg down like a rotten oak tree, hammering the exact same spot on his thigh until the muscle simply quit working and he collapsed. It was technical. It was highly effective, and it was incredibly boring to these people. "He quit, Lenny," Morgan rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed gravel. "Not my fault he didn't want a ruptured quad." "Yeah, well, the crowd's getting ugly." Lenny jerked a thumb over his shoulder at the sea of restless dock workers, gamblers, and insomniacs. A crumpled paper cup flew out of the smoky haze and bounced off Morgan's ankle. "Do the exhibition gimmick. 3 minutes. Pick a guy from the front rows. Humiliate him a little. Make him laugh. Then we pack it up." Morgan hated the exhibition round. It felt entirely hollow. She was a Nak Muay, a student of the 8 limbs. She wasn't a circus clown, and she despised being paraded as a parlor trick. But the cynicism in her gut reminded her of the unpaid gas bill taped to a refrigerator in the Mission District. Purity didn't keep the lights on. Lenny's $50 payout did. She turned her back on her promoter and leaned against the ropes. The thick, abrasive hemp dug into her damp shoulder blades. She scanned the crowd. Her eyes bypassed the loudmouths in the front row, the guys puffing out their chests, silently begging to get picked so they could brag about taking a hit from a female champion at the bar later. She wanted someone who wouldn't try to be a hero, someone who would just cover up, take a soft push kick to the chest, and fall over for the cheap pop. That's when she saw him. He was standing near the back, leaning casually against a rusted support pillar, while the rest of the room was a chaotic blur of shouting mouths and waving fists. He was perfectly still. He wore a simple gray jacket over a white button-down shirt, dark, neatly combed hair, tortoiseshell glasses. He looked like a university librarian who had taken a wildly wrong turn on his way home. But there was something deeply irritating about him. It wasn't smugness. It was the way he watched her. He wasn't looking at her hips or her chest, the way 90% of the men in this room did. His eyes tracked the subtle shifts in her shoulders. He was looking at her footwork, analyzing the way she distributed her weight between her hips. It rubbed her raw. She was tired, she was hurting, and she didn't want to be picked apart by some tourist in a crisp collar. She raised her left hand, the heavy blood-stained leather of her 16-ounce glove, pointing straight through the smoke-filled air. "You," Morgan said. Her voice cut through the dull roar of the warehouse. He didn't point to his own chest in surprise. He didn't look around to see if she meant someone else. He just blinked, tilting his head a fraction of an inch. "Yeah, the guy by the pillar," Morgan added, dropping her hand to her hip. "You're taking notes over there. Let's see if you can read them." A low murmur rippled through the room. The regulars turned to look at the stranger. A few laughed loudly. Lenny frowned, chewing hard on his cigar. "Morg, what are you doing? Pick one of the meatheads. This guy's gonna sue us if you chip his tooth." "I picked him," she said stubbornly. She looked back at the man. 3 minutes, just moving around. unless you're scared of a girl." It was a cheap, toxic line. She felt a flash of self-disgust for using it, but she was too exhausted to be creative. The man pushed off the beam. He didn't look embarrassed or intimidated. He handed his glasses to a startled stranger standing next to him, folded his gray jacket neatly over a folding chair, and walked toward the ring. His gait was strange. Morgan couldn't quite put her finger on it. Most men walked with a heavy heel-striking thud, throwing their weight aggressively forward. This guy seemed to glide, his center of gravity perfectly locked over his hips. He reached the ring apron and paused. He reached down and slowly unlaced his dark leather Oxfords, setting them neatly beside the steps. He didn't wait for Lenny to hold the ropes open. He just slipped between the middle and top ropes in one fluid, uninterrupted motion. He didn't catch his shirt on the coarse rope. He didn't scrape his back. He stepped through the narrow gap like water pouring through a funnel. He stood before her. Up close, he was smaller than she had thought. Lean, wiry, maybe 5'7". He had a faint, polite smile that didn't quite reach his dark, intense eyes. "I really don't want to disrupt your evening," he said. His voice was soft, melodic, carrying a slight, unplaceable accent. "I was just enjoying the mechanics of your hip rotation." "You get 3 minutes to enjoy it up close," Morgan said, tapping her gloves together. The hollow thump echoed in her ears. "Lenny, give him some gloves." The man raised a hand, palm out. The skin of his knuckles was heavily calloused, textured like rough pumice stone. "No, thank you. I won't need them." Morgan's jaw tightened. The cynicism in her gut boiled over into pure, hot anger. She was bleeding, bruised, and fighting for scraps in a damp basement, and this guy thought he could just stand in front of her bare-knuckled and survive on sheer arrogance. "Suit yourself," she hissed through her mouthpiece. "Protect yourself at all times. Or don't." Lenny struck the brass bell with a metal wrench. Ding. Morgan came forward. She wasn't going to hurt him badly, she told herself. Just a quick reminder of physical reality. A heavy teep to the sternum to knock the wind out of him, maybe a stiff jab to the nose to make his eyes water. Give the crowd their laugh. Go home. Put ice on her knees. She stepped in, dragging her rear foot, and snapped a sharp, probing left jab toward his face. It was a fast jab. Morgan took pride in her hands. But her glove met empty space. She hadn't even seen him move. He hadn't jerked his head back or panicked. He had just shifted his neck, maybe half an inch to the right. The padded leather of her glove grazed the cotton of his collar. A faint scent of clean laundry detergent wafted up, violently clashing with the metallic stench of the ring. Morgan frowned. A fluke. She planted her feet and threw a heavier 1-2 combination. Left jab, right cross, full extension on the shoulders, swish, swish. Nothing. He slipped the jab to the outside, then parried the cross by casually slapping her wrist downward. The contact was brief, but it sent a bizarre shock up Morgan's arm. His hand didn't feel like normal flesh and bone. It felt like a coil of heavy steel cable wrapped in thin leather. It wasn't a block. A block meant a collision of bone, a test of who could absorb more trauma. This was a theft. He stole her momentum, dragged it downwards, and let gravity do the heavy lifting. The downward pressure compromised her posture, pulling her right shoulder sharply forward and throwing her completely off balance. She stumbled half a step, her boot catching on a tear in the canvas. The crowd went dead silent. Morgan's face burned. The humiliation was sudden and suffocating. She reset her stance, biting down so hard on her mouthpiece her jaw ached. Fine. No more boxing. Time to chop the tree down. She faked a high hook, pivoted hard on her left foot, and swung her right leg in a vicious sweeping arc aimed directly at his lead thigh. It was a classic Muay Thai roundhouse, powered by the full rotation of her hips, meant to dig the hard bone of her shin deep into the muscle, a kick that broke baseball bats. But he wasn't there. He didn't jump back. He simply picked up his lead leg, turning his knee outward in a micro-adjustment that allowed her shin to pass harmlessly underneath. Because she had committed her full, angry weight to the kick, hitting nothing but air sent a violent torque through her pelvis. She spun clumsily, her back exposed for a fraction of a second, her boots squeaking wildly against the damp canvas trying to find traction. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. If he wanted to, he could have knocked her out right then. A strike to the back of the neck. A kidney punch. A sweep. She scrambled around, throwing up a high guard, her lungs pulling in ragged, shallow breaths. He was standing exactly where he had been, his hands resting lightly near his waist. He wasn't even breathing through his mouth. His face was entirely relaxed, watching her with that same detached, clinical curiosity. "You are throwing your kicks from the shoulder," he said softly. The words carried clearly over the silent warehouse. "You're signaling the hip rotation before the leg moves. Too loud." Morgan saw red. The raw, imperfect nature of her pride took completely over. She forgot the exhibition. She forgot Lenny. She forgot the $50. She let out a guttural wet sound and charged him. She bypassed striking altogether and went straight for the clinch. If she could grab the back of his neck, she could control his posture, bring his head down, introduce him to her knees, force him to deal with her physical strength. She crashed into him, her forearms sliding inside his guard, hands reaching desperately for the crown of his head to establish the plum tie. She expected resistance. She expected him to muscle backward, to frame on her hips or try to shove her away. Instead, she hit a void. As her hands clamped down, he stepped into her, closing the distance completely. Before she could process the movement, his forearms were weaving through hers like slick water. There was a sudden, intense pressure on the inside of her right bicep, pushing outward, while his other hand gently but firmly trapped her left wrist against her own chest. It made no sense. Her brain couldn't map the geometry of what was happening. She was heavier than him. She was stronger than him. She knew she was. But the angles he created stripped her of all leverage. He pivoted sharply, a subtle shift of his hips against hers. Morgan felt the floor vanish beneath her feet. Gravity became her enemy. She was thrown entirely by her own forward momentum, redirected by a slight turn of his waist and a gentle pull on her trapped arm. She hit the canvas hard. The impact rattled her teeth. The damp, coarse texture of the mat scraped the side of her face, smelling intensely of old sweat and ammonia. She lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, the halogen lights blinding her. The silence in the warehouse was absolute. No one was laughing. No one was cheering. The only sound was the high-pitched hum of the faulty bulbs and the frantic, ragged sound of her own breathing. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her vision swimming slightly. Her chest heaved. Her hair stuck to her wet forehead. He was looking down at her. He wasn't gloating. He didn't have his arms raised in triumph. He just offered a hand. "The structure of your clinch is strong," he said, his voice entirely devoid of sarcasm or pity. "But you rely too much on force. When you meet an empty space, your force becomes your own opponent." Morgan stared at the calloused hand offered to her. Her pride screamed at her to slap it away, to scramble up and throw a spinning elbow, to take his head off. But her body knew the brutal truth. Every aching muscle, every bruised knuckle, every clicking joint recognized the profound, terrifying gap between what she was doing and what he was doing. She was fighting. He was just expressing himself. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that decades later, people would talk about this man in hushed tones, treating him like a modern myth. She only knew that she was sitting on a dirty canvas in Oakland, and the universe had just shifted permanently on its axis. Flesh met flesh. And Morgan immediately noticed the temperature of his skin. He wasn't radiating the frantic, boiling heat of a fighter hopped up on adrenaline. His palm was surprisingly cool, dry, and steady. She wrapped her wrapped fingers around his wrist, bypassing his hand entirely out of pure, stubborn instinct, and let him pull her upward. He didn't heave her. He simply stepped back, using his body weight as a lever, and she found herself standing before she could even brace her knees. The warehouse remained suspended in an uncomfortable, jagged silence. The dock workers and gamblers didn't know how to process what they had just witnessed. They had paid to see blood, a knockout, or at least a comical mismatch. Instead, they had seen a ghost story. They had watched their local enforcer, a woman who kicked through ribs for a living, get dismantled by a man wearing a button-down shirt and a polite expression. Lenny was the first to break the vacuum. He scrambled onto the apron, his face an ugly shade of plum, waving his thick arms toward the rafters. All right, give it up for the exhibition round," Lenny bellowed, his voice cracking with artificial enthusiasm. "A nice round of applause for our brave volunteer. Let's get a hand for, the guy." A few scattered claps bounced off the corrugated tin ceiling, sounding pathetic and thin. Someone near the back coughed. Morgan didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes locked on the stranger. He was already turning away, retrieving his folded gray jacket from the folding chair. He slipped his arms into the sleeves, adjusted his collar, and picked up his leather Oxfords. He didn't put them on. He simply carried them, walking toward the exit in his socks, completely unbothered by the sticky, beer-soaked concrete floor. Morgan pushed past Lenny. She didn't wait for the promoter to hold the ropes open. She ducked through them, her boots hitting the concrete with a heavy, angry thud. "Morg, where are you going?" Lenny hissed, grabbing her elbow. His fingers dug into her sweaty skin, smelling intensely of stale cigar ash. "We got to do the photo ops. The guys from the shipyard want pictures." "Don't touch me, Len," Morgan rasped. She jerked her arm away, the sudden movement sending a fresh, hot spike of agony up her bruised shin. "I'm done for the night. Pay me tomorrow. Utini." She limped down the narrow hallway that led to the makeshift locker rooms. The corridor smelled like mold, bleach, and old copper piping. The overhead fluorescent tubes flickered erratically, casting sickly yellow shadows against the peeling green paint of the cinderblock walls. She pushed open the heavy metal door to the women's locker room. It was empty, freezing, and damp. She slumped onto the wooden bench, the wood bowing slightly under her weight, and buried her face in her wrapped hands. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. Her muscles spasmed, violently contracting as the fight-or-flight chemicals rapidly drained from her bloodstream. Her breath came in short, jagged hiccups. She unspooled the tape from her wrists, the adhesive tearing out tiny hairs on her forearms. The white fabric was stained brown with dried blood, mostly Hank's, some her own. She walked over to the rusted metal sink. The faucet squealed loudly as she twisted the cracked plastic knob. Cold, brown-tinted water sputtered out, eventually running clear. Morgan cupped her hands, splashed the freezing water onto her face, and kept doing it until her skin felt numb. She looked up at the cracked mirror. Her reflection stared back, looking hollow and bruised. There was a smear of grease on her left cheekbone. Her lower lip was split, a jagged red line weeping a slow bead of blood. But it wasn't the physical damage that terrified her. It was the absolute, crushing realization of her own mediocrity. For years, she'd been a big fish in a dirty, shallow pond. She relied on grit, bone density, and a high pain tolerance. She thought she understood violence, but what that man had done wasn't violence. It was physics. It was geometry. He had stripped her of her balance, her leverage, and her dignity, all without throwing a single punch. She changed out of her fight gear with robotic, jerky movements, pulling a heavy black hoodie over her head and shoving her feet into beat-up sneakers. She grabbed her gym bag, slung it over her aching shoulder, and pushed through the heavy rear exit door. The alleyway was a sharp contrast to the suffocating warehouse. San Francisco fog rolled in thick off the bay, carrying the distinct, salty smell of the ocean mixed with wet asphalt and rotting cardboard. The damp air instantly chilled the sweat lingering on her neck. She pulled her hood up, shivering violently, and dug into her pocket for a crumpled pack of cigarettes. Nicotine constricts the blood vessels. It slows the healing process of micro-tears in the muscle tissue. Morgan froze, the cheap plastic lighter hovering an inch from her face. He was standing near a stack of wooden pallets, leaning against the damp brick wall. He had put his shoes back on. In the dim, amber light of a distant street lamp, the lenses of his tortoiseshell glasses reflected the fog. He looked entirely ordinary, save for the absolute stillness of his posture. "Are you stalking me now?" Morgan asked. Her voice was raspy, defensive. She struck the lighter, cupping her hands against the wind, and inhaled deeply. The harsh smoke burned the back of her throat, a familiar, comforting punishment. I was waiting for a taxi, he said mildly. He nodded toward the end of the alley, where the busy street intersection hummed with passing headlights. They rarely come down this street, and I saw you leave through the back. Morgan leaned against the heavy steel door, crossing her arms over her chest. The cherry of her cigarette glowed a bright, angry orange in the gloom. You came out here to gloat? To tell me my hips are too tight again? No, he replied. He pushed off the brick wall and took a few slow steps toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. I waited because I respect your anger. Morgan let out a short, bitter laugh. A plume of gray smoke escaped her lips and vanished into the fog. My anger? Buddy, my anger just got me dumped on my ass in front of 200 people by a guy wearing slacks. Your application of force is deeply flawed, he said. The blunt honesty in his tone lacked any malice. It was purely clinical, like a mechanic diagnosing a cracked engine block. You fight like a person trying to push a mountain, but your spirit is genuine. When you missed that kick, you didn't look to the referee. You didn't complain about the canvas. You attacked. That raw forward pressure is rare. It cannot be taught. Yeah, well, it didn't do me much good, did it? She muttered, dropping the cigarette onto the wet asphalt and crushing it beneath her sneaker. Because you pour water into a cup that's already full, he said quietly. Morgan rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp groan. Are you about to hit me with fortune cookie wisdom? Tell me to be a leaf in the wind? He smiled. It was a real smile, crinkling the corners of his dark eyes. No, I want to talk about mechanics. May I? He gestured toward her left shoulder. Morgan hesitated. Every survival instinct screamed at her to walk away. She just wanted to crawl into her cramped apartment, tape an ice pack to her knee, and drown this embarrassing night in cheap beer. But a deeper instinct kept her boots glued to the wet concrete, the desperate urge of a fighter hitting a permanent plateau. She gave a stiff, jerky nod. He stepped closer. He smelled like mint leaves and clean cotton, a jarring contrast to the dumpster stench of the alley. He reached out, placing his right hand lightly on her left collarbone. When you threw your jab inside the ring, he said, his voice dropping to a focused murmur, your shoulder rose by almost 2 inches before your fist ever moved forward, right here. He tapped a tight knot of muscle near her neck. You tense your upper back to generate power. In doing so, you telegraph the movement to my eyes a full second before the punch leaves your hip. He shifted his hand, dragging dry fingertips down her bare arm to rest against her elbow. The physical touch felt incredibly precise, like a doctor palpating a swollen joint. You believe power comes from rigid tension, he continued softly. You clench your jaw, you tighten your deltoids, but tension acts as a physical brake. It slows the limb down. True speed comes from complete, absolute relaxation, right up until the exact fraction of a second before impact. He dropped his hand and took half a step backward. Throw a jab at my palm, slowly, 20% of your maximum speed. He raised his bare hand, holding his palm flat toward her face. Morgan felt deeply ridiculous. She stood in a filthy alleyway, shivering in a damp hoodie, taking a private lesson from a stranger who had just dismantled her entire reality. But she squared her hips, dragged her rear boot backward, and slowly extended her left arm. Stop, he said instantly. She froze, her arm floating halfway between them. Look at your shoulder, he instructed. You lifted it again. You are mentally preparing to hit me. Stop preparing. Just act. Morgan pulled her arm back to her chin. She took a deep breath, trying to force the rigid tension out of her neck. She dropped her shoulders, letting her heavy arms hang loose. She stopped thinking about punching through a solid object. She just thought about moving her knuckles from point A to point B. She snapped the jab forward. The leather of her sneakers squeaked against the slick pavement. Her fist hit his open palm with a sharp, cracking smack that echoed off the damp brick walls. It was not the heaviest punch she had ever thrown. Yet, it felt entirely different. It felt utterly effortless. There was no grinding pain in her rotator cuff. No ugly shockwave traveled back up her own arm. The kinetic energy transferred cleanly from her foot, passing through her hip, out her knuckles, and straight into his hand. The man nodded slowly, his dark eyes analyzing the geometry of her posture. Better, much better. You removed the obstacle. You removed yourself from your own way. Morgan lowered her hand, staring at her scraped knuckles under the amber street lamp. Her heart beat rapidly, but not from residual adrenaline. This was the pure thrill of discovery. She realized the solid ceiling she'd been hitting for 2 years was not a ceiling at all. It was just a heavy door. This quiet man held the keys. "Who are you?" Morgan asked. The bitter cynicism vanished from her voice completely, replaced by raw, naked curiosity. He checked a plain silver watch on his left wrist. "My ride is arriving," he said, looking past her shoulder toward the busy intersection. A yellow cab slowed down, its bright headlights piercing the thick maritime fog. "Wait," Morgan said, taking a frantic step forward. "You cannot just dump me on the mat, give me a 5-minute lecture on shoulder mechanics and disappear. Where do you train? I want to come down. I will pay." He paused, glancing back at her. The neon sign from a distant liquor store reflected in his glasses, obscuring his eyes. "I do not teach for money," he said softly. "I only share ideas with those who are willing to empty their cup. You have spent your whole life learning how to fight, Morgan. Now you must learn how to move." He turned and walked toward the waiting cab. His footsteps made absolutely no sound against the wet pavement. He moved through the heavy fog like a ghost, slipping into the back seat of the taxi and closing the door with a soft click. The red taillights flared, and the car pulled away, vanishing into the dense gray mist of the city. Morgan stood completely alone in the freezing cold alleyway. She looked down at her bare hands, slowly opening and closing her bruised fingers. Tomorrow, she would enter the dusty gym with a completely brand new perspective. The real work had finally begun. Did Morgan's encounter with the legend himself leave you breathless? Sometimes the greatest lessons come dressed in the most unassuming packages. If you loved this deep dive into the untold grid of martial arts history, don't leave us hanging in the ring. Hit that like button, share this story with your fellow fighting enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel for more raw, legendary tales. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a punch. See you in the next one.